Hello everybody, welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today we're doing a box office preview for this upcoming weekend, which will see the release of two new films 28 years later. This is part of the 28 Days franchise, which is now apparently a thing. 20 years later itself is actually the first of three movies. One film actually set to come out next year with a new director Nia DaCosta of The Marvels fame. That will be very interesting to see. And then a follow-up about a year or two later with the same director as the entirety of the franchise. And so it'll be interesting to see exactly what happens with this movie, but we also have a new Disney Pixar film. Crazy that it's a Disney Pixar film, actually, called Elio, which is expected to have one of the worst openings for a Disney Pixar film ever, and expected to lose quite a bit of money. And that's also assuming that this random budget that's being now reported of $150 million after previous reports from places like World of Real and others said that the budget's actually ballooned to almost $300 million. Whichever one you believe, whichever one you go with, it's not going to be a good run here for Elio. The chances of it getting to a break even, regardless of whatever that budget might be, is not good. And honestly, Elio itself and the losses that are going to likely come from Elio will most likely be enough to take away at least a large portion of any of the profits that Disney has made from the live action Lilo and Stitch. So big trouble continues for Disney here, because yes, they have big hits like Lilo and Stitch, but then they also still have their big box office losers like Elio, and I imagine that we'll probably see some similar struggles with Fantastic Four and some of the other releases that they have going on this year. Of course, much of that might be done away with as far as losses, because they do have Avatar to look forward to, and for some reason the Avatar films continue to make money because people continue to spend money on them, even though the stories themselves are very vapid and a complete waste of time. But that's just my own personal view here. So let's go ahead and dive into these numbers before I go off on a whole tirade about Avatar. Starting first off with 28 years later. So personally, I am a fan of the 28 Days franchise. I love the original film, 28 Days Later. I really enjoy the 28 Weeks Later film as well, so I'm looking forward to this one. What's interesting is that so far the reviews that I've been looking at least online and amongst fans, is relatively mixed, right? There's some who say it's really, really good. There's some who say that, it's fine, it does what it needs to do. There's a lot of tension, and if you like that type of zombie kill tension stuff, then you'll enjoy the movie, but that it's really lacking anything else than that. And I've heard some say that it's kind of a bit of a mess, especially in the third act. Again, regardless of whatever review you yourself hold to, if you've seen the movie itself, again, I mostly go off of the people who vote on Critic List because it tends to be more real people and more honest reviews in general versus the general craziness that is Rotten Tomatoes amongst other sites. As of right now, with 10 votes in, so a very small sample size at this point, the audience score is at a 55% decent score, but I will say that is with two people, for some reason, putting 0 and 5%. I think that's a bit too much. And again, shout out to Shorty Short, Laura, I love her. But that is, even for me, that's like, oh man, I don't even give zeros to a lot of movies. In fact, I can't think of one off the top of my head that I have given that low of a score to. I've given 10s and 15s before, mostly for like the Disney Plus MCU shows, which have just been heinous and atrocious. But for movies, again, typically I'm in that bogus, maybe higher heinous score, maybe in the 18 or 19% range there. And so again, take the grade with a grain of salt. As more people go to see the movie, we'll probably get a more realistic score here. That's why I like using 28 years later. But with that being the case, it doesn't matter a whole lot because the movie is still expected to do very, very well. So again, Box Office Theory currently has the projections for 28 years later at between $26 and $34 million. And that's against the traditional industry tracking of $28 million. And so as of right now, things are looking very, very good. In fact, this would be the highest opening of the franchise's history. If you go over to the comparison between 28 Days and 28 Weeks Later, as you can see, the first film opened with an adjusted for inflation number, obviously trying to be as fair as we can, to $18 million, whereas the sequel actually only opened up to $16 million. It's kind of interesting that 28 Days Later ended up actually making a lot more than 28 Weeks Later, even when you adjust those numbers for inflation. And so $155 million was the total gross for 28 Days versus $105 million for 28 Weeks at that point. Released around the same time. Again, 28 Weeks didn't get quite the same release as far as the summertime, so that could be a reason as to why its opening was not as big, etc., because it is, the kind of the rated R horror fare. So that very well could be a case for it not doing as well. But the fact is that 28 years later is expected to have the highest opening by a pretty good margin, right? So if the highest grossing at this point is 18 million when you adjust for inflation, and Box Office Theory has it at 30 million as their pinpoint projection, yeah, that's pretty darn good. Even if it does get to that 28 million of the traditional industry tracking, it's still much better than the 18, and even the low end of the 28 years later Box Office Theory tracking is still much better too. So things are looking really, really good for this release. And though the movie also has one of the highest budgets of the franchise, if you go back in time, you can see it was around $15 million worth of a budget for 28 Days Later. Again, these are adjusted numbers too. And the 28 Weeks Later went up to $24 million. The current film cost around $60 million, I believe. Yeah, $60 million budget according to thenumbers.com. So obviously we look at these numbers here and think, okay, it's got to do quite a bit more than the other films. But again, if we see these opening numbers and if the tracking continues on after that, having a similar run, if it's got good word of mouth as the other films tended to have, then we could expect the film to be able to go past that $150 million threshold that the franchise really has at this point, again, with that first movie from 28 Days Later. So again, I suspect that break even and profit is likely in the future for this movie, especially since, again, we're seeing a lot of positive reviews, even though we are still getting some mixed signals as well. Same cannot be said for the film Elio. Elio, according to the guys over at Film Thread, especially Alan, it is apparently the worst Pixar film ever made, and he questions how in the world it ever came to existence and who actually made it. And this is coming from someone at Film Threat who they don't typically take those kinds of stances on movies, right? They were very friendly towards Lilo and Stitch, for instance, very friendly towards How to Train Your Dragon, though of course I think they had their criticisms as well. It is interesting, though, that they would frame it in that way because it does point to the fact that Elio probably isn't all that good of a film. Again, I have not seen it myself, have no real desire to go and see it. But again, I will, of course, save my own thoughts for that moment when I eventually do or do not see the movie. But this film's only expected to make 18 to 24 million. This is an animated movie in the summertime. A Disney Pixar animated movie in the summertime, only opening to 18 to 24. Keep in mind, right, this is just domestic, but think back to what How to Train Your Dragon and what it did, right? It did $200 million globally, $300 million globally for Lilo and Stitch live action and for a Minecraft movie. Elio at 18-24 million, maybe we're looking at, 50 million or less in total, with global totals in? Oh boy, it is not looking good. Now, traditional tracking has the number higher at 25 million. I think this is much more realistic take, though, because, again, I don't think the marketing has been all that strong. But also, again, Disney, especially under their relationships with Pixar, has really just gone downhill quite a bit. And this is also that reminder that why is it that these studios aren't releasing original films? It's because no one's going to see them. But it's not because the films are really, really good and people are choosing not to support them. It's because the films that they're releasing are apparently a bunch of hot messes, right? Elio actually had change of directors. They had one director in the first place. He couldn't finish the movie, and so they brought on two women to then go on and continue directing it. And so there are 3 total directors that are credited to the movie, which means that there were reshoots, which is why, again, that budget of $150 million being reported does not sound quite right when we know that they spend at least $150 million on their animated movies. This is, of course, Disney, after all, Disney Pixar. So the chances of reshoots happening and delays happening and the budget staying right at $150, not realistic at all. Again, I don't know if $300 million is necessarily realistic either, which is why, again, I'm going to withhold any more further comments on that. But to say that $150 million is the budget is also just as, I think, ridiculous. And again, I think that we're probably looking closer to $200, maybe $250 million of budget if we were being more realistic here. Now, Box Office Theory does go on to say that How to Train Your Dragon live action is going to win the weekend, $38.8 million. There are some fans of the 28 Days franchise, though, that think, hey, 28 years later could actually have strong word of mouth, could actually have a much stronger walk-up audience, and could actually do better. So 28 years later, I would actually say has a chance to win the weekend, though I think that there's a stronger chance for How to Train Your Dragon because obviously nothing can really beat that Saturday AM audience showing that just always shows up in droves for these kids movies, for these family movies. So 38.8. But hey, what's interesting is this is a 54% drop for How to Train Your Dragon. That's a pretty staggering drop for an animated movie, right? These are the films that tend to hold very, very well down the line. So having a drop 54%, again, in general, if this was just a general movie release, wouldn't be the worst in the world. But we kind of go back to what we saw with some of the other films that have released more recently, and we realize, okay, why is it that films like Lilo and Stitch are likely not going to get to $1 billion. Well, a big part of that's because they didn't hold nearly as well as other films, other family films, other kids movies have actually done. How to Train Your Dragon seems to be following in a very similar scheme here. Now, again, I'm not saying the film's going to lose money. The film Its budget was overall not too shabby, was not too bad. It was actually, I think, even less than that of the original animated movies. But still, it's not, I think, as strong as what they were going to be hoping for. And it does, I think, once again, remind everybody why $1 billion is not going to happen for this movie. People wonder, why do I keep bringing that up? Because, again, these studios want to hit those numbers. They want to be, in this case, the first to hit $1 billion this year, but also because it's a good thing to sell to your shareholders, right? If you're able to say, oh, yeah, look, we had, billions of dollars made in box office revenue, they can usually run with that very easily. That's also why I think Elio is getting that number being released as $150 million, because I don't think Disney thinks that the movie's going to make much more than that. And at least if the film makes $150 million globally, they'll be able to argue saying, oh, yeah, well, we only spent 150 and we made 150, so we're all good. Not realizing that, of course, not how the box office works, but they also assume that most people, even shareholders, don't know how the box office works, and they're going to try to use that as a way to kind of write it off and say, oh, everything will be fine down the line. Elio will be okay in the grand scheme of things, but oh boy, catastrophe going on for them. So going into the rest of the 28 years later, $30 million, again, very strong number there. Elio only $20.4 million in their pinpoint forecasting, and then Lilo and Stitch following that up with a 20% hold. So again, much stronger hold than we were seeing last weekend, $12.5 million. So again, Lilo and Stitch, $1 billion is not completely off the table, but it is a lot less likely than it was just a few weeks ago. Going to Box Office Pros, they also have How to Train Your Dragon, the number one spot. They have the higher number here at $40 to $48 million in their range. 20 years later, $35 to $45 million. So that's why you can see why there are some who speculate, hey, 28 years later, potentially could do this, right? Danny Boyle's franchise here. And then Elio, $20 to $30 million. Again, interesting to see exactly where this thing is going to fall. Is it going to fall on that lower end, which is what Box Office Theory thinks, or is it going to be closer to the industry, so-called experts, which is what Box Office Pro seems to be supporting in this instance? Going over to Box Office Report, lastly, we have $40.5 million being projected here for How to Train Your Dragon. That's a 52% drop. So again, very similar numbers that we've seen previously. 28 years later at $35 million, so still within striking distance. So it'll be interesting to see what that final number ends up being. And then Elio at $24 million, again, a little bit on the higher side versus likes of Box Office of Box Office Theory. So again, be interesting battle to see which one of those comes up on top. Going over to our charts, because we love charts here on OMB Reviews. Just a reminder that 28 years later costs $60 million, and Elio, they say it costs $150 million, but as I mentioned before, the film is reported by World of Real, this was months ago, actually had its budget ballooned all the way up to $300 million. So the film's break even then is going to be between $450 and probably closer to $900 million. So I guess a pretty wide range there. It depends on which one you go with. But with an opening of only around $20 million domestically, almost maybe 50, we could guess, $1 million in the global market space, that is not going to get you to $450 million. So even at the lower budget, the chances of this movie getting to that point, not likely. Also, Disney tends to spend more on marketing, and so that break-even point's probably even higher because the total cost is probably actually closer to $250 million. In fact, let's go ahead and kind of try to split the baby here with these things. Oh, definitely not $2.5 billion. So again, because some people say, oh, why don't you put the budget higher? Well, again, marketing at the very least would likely be that much. And so that's why this break even's probably even higher than the $250 million cost would indicate, because this is 3 times the budget. And obviously that's not including marketing cost. So overall, still not looking all that great for it. Some updates on the overall box office for some of the other films. Materialist, $21 million in the red. Again, not a whole lot of movement with this movie. Let me just make sure that these numbers have updated. We love to do things live here on OMB Reviews. It helps me to stay honest with everybody. So let's make sure that those are the most recent updates. These are from thenumbers.com. Yeah, $15.5 million, so $21 million in the red. How to Train Your Dragon at $252 million globally at this point, so that's $100 million in the red. So I do think the film's still going to be able to break even, but still has a ways to go. Ballerina hasn't hit $100 million yet, according to the reported numbers. So again, $90.1 million in the red at this point. Bring Her Back, $19 million in the red. Karate Kid at $23 million in the red. Mission Impossible, over $500 million globally, but still $374 million in the red because of how much its budget was. $864 million for Lilo and Stitch, and Final Destination Bloodlines at $54 million in net profit, net gain. So those are the updates for those. But what are y'all's thoughts? Are you going to see 20 Years Later or Elio this week? If you did, what were your thoughts about those movies? And also, how well do you think they're going to do? 20 Years Later, I think right now, though it seems kind of mixed in the reviews, I think it's going to do very, very well. Probably the best performing, at least opening weekend of the franchise. Usually that extends out further, right? Especially if the word of mouth is at least fine. So I'll have to wait and see. I'm going to try and see the movie later today before FNT. And also, what are your thoughts on Elio? Again, no real desire to see it myself. Marketing hasn't been all that compelling. If you look at a trailer from like a couple of years ago versus what it is now, apparently the story has changed quite significantly because of those new directors. And so that raises that ultimate question again of, okay, who's this movie for? And who is actually going to see this movie? Let me know your thoughts on that also in the comments below. If you like this video, make sure you smash that like button. Make sure you smash that rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing and beautiful. Have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed Friday, and as always, God bless. Now for a huge special shout out to all of my Chosen of Valhalla members, starting off first with my people on Patreon, Father Luca Illick and Miss Martin Muses. Check out her YouTube channel by the same name, Miss Martin Muses. Also to my Subscribestar people, Matt317. Check out his Twitch channel by the same name, Matt317. Also a huge shout out to my newest YouTube member, Raichu. And lastly to my YouTube member, Mr. Roy. Shout out to you, good sir. And if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, check out the top link in the video description below where you get access to that. Also, you get access to a plethora of other things. You get your name listed at the end of every live stream and video, like you saw in those names that came up before this video started. And also access to a giveaways channel that I host over on the Discord server where I give away 4Ks, Steelbooks, Blu-rays, all kinds of stuff. So check that out if you're interested in that. Also, I have an exclusive podcast that I hold at least once a month, and it's always a good time, and you get extra bonus content with that also. So if any of that sounds interesting, again, check out that top link in the video description below. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, God bless.